In the last video, we ended with cutting up the Sentra SCR and basically taking it to scrap. This kind of picks up by taking the engine and separating the transmission to continue with a hydraulic clutch conversion that I've mentioned in videos past. This involves changing the release fork as the arms on top are oriented differently between the cable clutch and the hydraulic system. The slave cylinder bolts onto the bell housing where the cable support bracket used to go, so this all needs to be changed. With the engine still hanging on the cherry picker, the intake manifold is removed in order to gain access to the back of the block. The old oil filter housing is removed in favor of an adapter that will allow plumbing a remote filter and oil cooler. Also, if you recall, the SCR didn't have power steering, while neither will the RS. I had an idea that I would remove the power steering pump and run the alternator in the back, but I've decided to leave the alternator in the front, and instead I'm building a bracket with an idler pulley in order to tension the belt that drives the water pump. With the intake manifold on the bench, I can start cleaning it up and simplifying it. Block-off plates are being made to delete the idle air control valve, and all the unnecessary vacuum ports are being cut off and welded shut. Cold idle might be a little tricky now, but this is a race car and it's not going to spend a lot of time warming up without me in the car. Without a manifold vacuum source, however, the PCV system is also going to need to be modified. The valve cover is getting tapped for AN fittings, which will be routed to an aftermarket catch can that will utilize the air intake for a vacuum source. This will simplify things and clean up the whole engine bay. I have to remove a few pieces off the firewall that were kind of temporarily placed for test fitting purposes, because I'm going to start cutting and welding here in just a bit. But first I've got to climb underneath the car and fit the skid plate that was on the SCR. It used to be bolted to the frame rails with some captive nuts that were welded into the car, but those aren't factory parts, so I need to hang everything underneath in order to find where to place some captive nuts and weld them into the frame rails. Fortunately, there's some holes that were factory that these flange nuts will fit into nicely. I'm also poking a hole in the firewall for a bulkhead fitting that will direct brake fluid to the rear of the car. That brings us to the next part. In a previous episode, I discussed how I was planning on eliminating the vacuum-assisted brake booster. This will provide better braking feedback on stage, but the trade-off requires significant increase in the amount of force applied to the brake pedal. So in order to regain some mechanical advantage, I'm going to drill a new hole into the brake pedal arm so the plunger will connect higher on the brake pedal arm. I couldn't get any of the parts from the original plunger setup to work, so I bought a universal part and then persuaded it to fit with some cutting and grinding. And then with that done, I can test fit the master cylinders and the flexi lines and all that. Next, the K-frame needs to get dropped from underneath the car for some more stitch welding. There's a lapse in footage here for some reason, so with the power of movie magic, you'll see that the top of the firewall is completely stitch welded where it wasn't before. Also, the strut towers are going to get cleaned up a little bit to ensure that the suspension fits properly. Then I climb back under the car to finish stitch welding a few spots, as well as welding in those flange nuts into the frame rails for the skid plate support. I talked my father-in-law into coming over to lend his expertise with this next part. This is a sheet of high-density polyethylene that I special ordered at one of the local chain home improvement stores. It's easily cut and trimmed with a jigsaw with a wood blade. So to start, the original door cards were used as a template, and then holes were cut for the handles and the window cranks. And then holes were drilled around the perimeter where the original door card was screwed onto the door. These end up turning out pretty well, but we're gonna have to go through this whole process again since I also have a set of power doors that I've decided I want to use primarily, and these manual crank doors will be used as backup for changing between sanctioning bodies so I don't have to re-sticker my doors all the time. Here we're cutting out the handbrake bracket that was in the SER before it got scrapped. I figured it was easier to recycle this bracket than to build a new one from scratch, and I ended up trimming it down a little bit so it wouldn't intrude on the co-driver's space too much. It ended up working out pretty well. Now we're back inside the car cleaning up a few spots on the roll cage with the grinder just to prevent snags or scratches while climbing in and out of the car or around inside the car. Then the dash support bar gets put back in so a new dash can be fitted. I started out with the dash from the SER, but it was hacked up pretty significantly. It was easy to get it in and out of the car, but I was looking to get something a little more neat and tidy when it was finished. So this process was very time-consuming, tedious, and messy because I had to measure it, cut it, test fit, pull it back out, grind a little bit here, reinstall it, remove it again, trim a little bit there until it was a pretty good fit around the roll cage. Bearing in mind that there will eventually be a windshield again, I needed to make sure that the dash could be installed and removed easily without being able to access it through the windshield opening like I can now. Here I'm welding in a couple patch panels that I cut out to cover the holes where the chassis harness originally passed into the engine bay from the wheel wells. These wires are going to be rerouted to avoid being damaged on stage. And then here we're welding in a battery tie down from a circle track car that I bought from Summit. It was easier than building one from scratch.